Solving proportions. Well, how do I solve proportions? There's actually a couple of different ways you could do this. Just remember that the product of the means equals the product of the extremes in a proportion, meaning that if you multiply the means, you get 24, and if you multiply the extremes, you get 24. That should be equal. In a proportion, the product of the means equals the product of the extremes, and that'll be important, as you'll see a little bit later. Now, one way that you can solve proportions, missing terms, and sometimes the easiest method is to just use equivalent fractions. For example, in this example, 6 times 3 would be 18. So if you do 5 times 3, it's 15. So the missing term would be 15. And that can be a lot easier than cross-multiplying the means and extremes. Now, sometimes when you look at a proportion, it'll look like you can't use that method, but actually you can. If you simplify 6/9, which would be, you can divide each one by 3, that would simplify to 2/3. Now you could use equivalent fractions. 2 times 8 is 16, 3 times 8 is 24, so that missing term is 24. Now there are times where that won't work, and you're going to have to cross-multiply. So here's how that would work. If you multiply the means and extremes, so you do 2 times m is 2m, and 5 times 12 is 60. Now you have a nice easy one-step equation. Divide each side by 2, so your missing term would be 30. And these don't always come out to whole numbers, and you can represent your answer as a decimal or as a mixed number or a fraction. Okay. Oh, this is pretty important. What a lot of kids will do, because they've multiplied fractions and they've cross-canceled, you cannot do that on a proportion. You cannot cross-cancel on a proportion. That will not work. That's pretty important. Now you can simplify. You can simplify one side, as you saw, but you cannot cross-cancel. All right, let's try a few of these. So on these two examples, we're going to use equivalent fractions. So 6 times what is 18? 6 times 3 is 18. So 8 times 3 is what? It's 24. So our missing value would be 24. On this next example, it looks like you can't use equivalent fractions because 15 times something is not going to give you 24, at least not times a whole number. But if we simplify this, we divide each one by 5, because you can simplify fractions, you get 2/3. And now we could use equivalent fractions. 3 times what is 24? Well, 3 times 8, we do the top times 8, our missing value would be 16. So that's how you can solve proportions using equivalent fractions. Let's try cross-multiplying. So I'm going to multiply the means first, and 4 times, and it doesn't matter which I do first, but I'm going to do 4 times m is 4m. Then I'm going to multiply the extremes. 3 times 12 is 36. Now I've got a nice easy one-step equation to solve. So to isolate the variable, I'm going to divide by 4. Divide this side by 4. So our missing value was 9. Let's do another one. So I'm going to multiply the means. M times 12 is 12m. I'm going to multiply my extremes. 2 times 36 is 72. And now I have a nice easy one-step equation. So to isolate the variable, since this is multiplication, I'll do the inverse property. I'm going to divide. And our missing value would be 6. So you have two methods of solving proportions. You can cross-multiply, or you can use equivalent fractions. And again, sometimes equivalent fractions, I just want to point out, is a lot easier than if you cross-multiply. For example, on this problem that we did here, it was pretty easy using equivalent fractions. If you cross-multiplied, you'd have to do 15m equals 240, which is a little more difficult. On this one, you would have to do 6m equals 8 times 18. Again, a little more difficult. I like to do equivalent fractions whenever I can. That's my favorite way of solving a proportion. But you have two different methods. You can use equivalent fractions, or you can use cross products to solve proportions.